Hello and welcome to this Play Better Chess video. So today I'll go over habits to improve your chess. And I'll do that by covering a game that was played in 1961, the World Chess Championship match between Mikhail Tal and Botvinnik. So in 1960, the year prior, Mikhail Tal had won against Mikhail Botvinnik to become the world chess champion. And then they had a rematch in which Botvinnik came back and won and regained his title. So in this game, it looks like Tal is rated higher compared to his opponent. But it should be an interesting matchup between the two. A quick game review here, and it shows that Botvinnik played with 96% accuracy versus 80.2 by Tal. And Botvinnik played at a 2850 rating level versus 2250 by Tal. So Mikhail Tal did have some health problems over the years. So sometimes when he played at a lower level, it was because his health was affecting him. So that may have played a factor in this game. But let's see what happened and what habits we can learn to help you improve your chess. All right, so let me turn on the computer analysis, and here we go. So Botvinnik begins with c4. So a good habit to help you play better chess is try to control the center of the board. Okay, so for beginners out there, you may not know about this concept. More experienced players, of course, know to control the center of the board, especially these four squares here. So this move here, it pushes the pawn forward and attacks this square here. So it does cover a central square. And that's what you want to do with your opening moves. In general, you want to develop pieces so they attack these central squares. And now, if you place a piece on a central square, it doesn't really cover it. It doesn't control that square. So you have to place your pawns and pieces where they're attacking the central squares. And another habit to get into, if you're going to develop your knight up here to c3, you don't always have to do this, but it can be beneficial, is to push the c pawn first and then drop the knight in behind it. That way you're not blocking the c pawn, which can be a good pawn to use to attack the center. All right, so Tal responds with knight to f6, controlling valuable central squares, and his opponent develops that knight in behind the pawn. And we see here that the pawn and the knight are working together to cover this important square in the center. So that's a good habit to get into, is to aim at squares in the center and just pile your pieces up to where they're attacking that square all together. All right, so now there's a fight for this square. So we have the knight and the pawn attacking, and likewise for white. So another good habit to get into is place two center pawns side by side. Sometimes you can even place three pawns or more in the center, but we have this pawn covering that important central square, and the other pawn covers this one. So they're doing a good job together of controlling the center. And now we have a bishop developing early, pinning the knight to the king here. Now, another habit to get into that will help you play better chess is to develop your knights before bishops. Now, all these habits and general rules, they do have exceptions. So you kind of have to do a little bit of calculation, or make sure you have a good reason for breaking the general principles or rules. So a general principle is to develop knights before bishops because the knights are slower and it takes them longer to get across the board, whereas a bishop can just zoom across the board in one move. All right, so the knight is pinned, and now we have a3. So another good habit to get into is avoid moving these side pawns unless you have a good reason. Here, it forces this bishop to make a decision to either retreat or capture the knight. So, of course, here Botvinnik doesn't want to waste time, and that's a good habit to get into. Try not to put your pieces on squares where the pawns can attack them and force them to retreat. Now, like I said, there's always exceptions where you might want to retreat the bishop and keep your bishop pair. And that's another good habit to get into, is to keep both of your bishops unless you have a good reason for giving that bishop up. And here, there is a good reason. The knight is captured, forcing the pawn to recapture. And now black has kind of wrecked the pawns over here on the queen side. We have an isolated pawn, which is kind of weak over here all by itself. And then we have these two pawns doubled, one in front of the other, where this pawn will slow down the one behind it. Now, on the other side of that, these pawns are controlling good squares in the center. So the game continues with this pawn move on the side. Now, here's an exception on why you would want to do that, because the bishop wants to develop here maybe, or even here, either attacking this pawn, or excuse me, attacking this pawn, or attacking down towards the king side. So here we have f3 being played, and this is this opening was called the Nimzo-Indian defense, and this is this Samish variation. And what this does is, in case the bishop develops here, it kind of limits the scope of the bishop. Especially if this pawn is pushed forward, it'll be backed up. So this pawn is attacking a good central square here, and it also reinforces the e pawn, allowing it to possibly jump forward here and help control the center. So another good habit to get into is to limit the scope of your opponent's pieces, cutting off their squares. Now if the bishop moves here, it can't aim as far down towards the opponent's king side because this pawn is kind of stopping the opponent's bishop here on e4. And especially if if the e pawn jumps up, then that limits the scope of the bishop even more. So a good habit to get into to improve your chess is try to put your pieces on squares where they control and cover more squares than your opponent's piece. So here, if we look at this position, black has a better knight here than his opponent's knight, which is stuck down here on the back rank. And then once this bishop develops, it'll be, of course, better than his opponent's bishop down here. All right, moving on. The bishop, instead of lining up on this diagonal where it'll be blocked by pawns, it decides to jump here and put some pressure on this pawn here on c4, this doubled pawn. And the game continues with e4. So look at all these central pawns just controlling all these central squares here, here, and even here and here. So the pawns are doing a good job of controlling the center better than the opponent. But the bishop's putting a little bit of pressure on this pawn. So what does Botvinnik do here? After Tal pushes forward, and another good habit to get into is if your opponent, like Botvinnik here, is controlling all of the center, you want to fight for the center. You don't want to just let your opponent take control of everything and play too passively. So this is considered a mistake here, and we'll have to see how Botvinnik capitalizes on this. Well, he captures. So now it unleashes a fight between these two bishops. So what does Tal do? He captures. Now, after the king recaptures, the king is kind of stuck here, unable to castle. And that's a habit you want to get into as well, is to castle early and often, because your king is generally safer once it castles. So Tal has prevented Botvinnik's king from castling, and now he captures in the center here, the best move. And a bishop is developed here, pinning the knight to the queen, but the computer says this is a mistake. White is still ahead, but e5 would have been better, chasing that knight. So here there's still a threat of pushing the pawn forward and attacking the pinned knight. That's a possibility. So what happens next here? We have h6. So once again, you don't want to move these pawns on the edge of the board unless you have a good reason. And here it just forces white to make a decision to either capture or retreat. And so what does he do? He ignores that in favor of a check here. So apparently this is an inaccuracy, and just capturing the knight right away would have been better. And then if the queen captured, you could once again push this pawn forward and attacking the queen if the queen recaptures here. All right, so in the game, the pawn blocks the path of the queen here, but that was an inaccuracy. It looks like it would have been better just to develop the queen to d7 and attack white's queen. So the bishop retreats. That way it cannot be captured by the pawn, but it keeps this pin on the knight. And apparently this is not the way to go. The bishop should have just captured that knight. All right, so now we have a capture in the center. Instead of a recapture, because this pawn could attack the bishop would have to retreat, and then the knight could recapture. Although, there's this danger. If the knight would be in the center, this rook could pin the knight to the king here. So kind of a lot going on, a big fight for the center. And that's what you want to get in a habit of doing to improve your chess, is fight for the center of the board. Why is the center of the board so important? Well, if you control the center, it'll be easier for you to just maneuver your pieces through the center of the board and into the enemy territory. And from the center, you can more easily place your pieces wherever they need to go. As opposed to having a blocked center, especially if your opponent's controlling the center, it might be harder to maneuver your pieces, and your position could be a little bit cramped. So the bishop is under attack. This is a mistake. It would have been better to just develop the other knight right away. The bishop retreats to the best square, and now we have the queen. I don't know if this is the greatest move, because now you have a rook lined up on the queen and the king here. And that's usually not a good idea when you have a position like that. So, that's a habit for you to get into as well. Try and line your rooks up on valuable enemy pieces, especially the king and the queen here, because if the center opens up, then there's a discovered attack on these pieces. So the game continues with knight developing here, trying to improve this knight, which was not doing much on the back rank. Another habit to get into is to try and develop all your pieces off the back rank, especially knights and bishops. Connect your rooks together so they can back each other up. And once you remove the pieces from in between the rooks, that gives them more room to maneuver. And another good habit to get into is to place your rooks on open files, half open files, or behind pawns that you plan to push forward. Or behind pawns that you plan to exchange, so it opens up the rooks. All right, the queen is under attack. It retreats back, adding more pressure to this pawn. So now we have a mistake made by Tall. He goes pawn hunting after this isolated pawn over here, but this is a mistake. Once again, it would have been better to just develop the other knight, which is not doing anything over here, but blocking in this rook. So now we have the best move, h4, being played. Because the threat here is to capture this pawn, and then this pawn cannot recapture, or else the rook would grab the opponent's rook. So, Tal captures first to avoid that trap, and then the bishop recaptures, attacking the unprotected knight. So another habit to get into is to, once a move is made by your opponent or before you make a move, look for checks, captures, and threats in that order. You want to look to see if there are any checks against your king or your opponent's king. And if there are checks, can they be followed up and with other pieces and lead to a checkmate? Or if you could be checked, you want to make sure that it doesn't get you in trouble. So you may need to defend that. That's why it's important to look for possible checks first. And then captures. So are there any unprotected pieces that you could capture right away that your opponent just left under attack? And if not, then you can look for threats like this one here, threatening to just capture an unprotected knight. So the knight is reinforced and protected, and now Botvinnik tries to improve the position of his knight, but it looks like it would have been better to just capture this pawn right away. So we have queenside castling. So finally, Tall castles, but you have to watch out when you castle into a position where the pawns have been pushed forward, because that leaves gaps in your defenses where these pawns have pushed forward, creating holes. All right, so the knight repositions up towards the center, attacking. So now we have two attackers and only one defender. So something has to be done about that. So Tall ignores that. And he plays a mistake here. It would have been better just to capture. But Tall is known as being a crazy attacking player. He just had a bad game in this one, and we'll see what happens here. So the king moves forward, a great move, because what did that do? It allows the rooks to communicate with one another, to back each other up. So if we have a capture here and the knight captures, the rook captures, well, then this rook would be able to capture here. So knight captures, pawn captures towards the center. Another habit to get into is if you have the possibility of capturing with a pawn on the edge of the board towards the center, it's usually good to do that, especially if you have a choice of capturing away from the center or towards the center. In general, it's good to capture towards the center because now you have another pawn in the center that controls all these squares along with the pawn beside it. So all these squares are being controlled in the center by these two valuable pawns. So the game continues with a block here. If we go back, we have to look at this. After the knight captured, there is this discovered attack now on the rook, but because it's a check, that has to be taken care of first. So capture, and now this threat has to be dealt with. The rook can't run away because he's trapped by his own pieces. So the pawn blocks that attack. And now we have a rook attacking the queen. So habits to improve your chess. Another one is look for tactics. Study tactics regularly. Just a simple tactic like this. This skewer attacking the queen will have to retreat, and then you can pick off this unprotected pawn. So look for those unprotected pieces and pawns, and then create threats against them. And here the queen retreats, and we have a pawn being picked off. So now it looks like material is even again. So it was +1, 1 pawn ahead for Tall, but after this capture it's even. And the queen captures in the center. So Tall goes ahead in material by 1 pawn. And after a capture, recapture, the bishop is under attack here. So instead of worrying about this bishop, we have a check on the king. So that is blocked, the best move. And now, instead of capturing this pawn, because that could lead to a tactic. If this pawn is captured, well then there is the fork here, attacking the bishop and the king, and that rook would be able to snag this bishop. So you have to watch out for these tactics. Habits to improve your chess definitely include keeping an eye out for tactics, study tactics regularly, by watching videos, doing puzzles and chess problems on the computer or in books. Read about tactics. The more you study tactics, the better that will help you in your chess games to attack your opponent and defend against tactics. All right, the bishop drops back here, piling up on the pinned knight. So a habit to get into is if you can pin a piece, then you can try and win it. So pin it and then win it. And how do you do that? You pin the piece first, and then you add pressure by attacking it with another piece, or pawn even. So the king jumps forward here, attacking the unprotected rook. And now there are 2 pieces, rook and king, both protecting that knight. So the rook doubles up. Another habit to improve your chess is to use your rooks together, creating a battery of 2 rooks working together. And sometimes you can even triple up with a queen on a file or rank as well. So all 3 of them work together. So here they're controlling this A file, and there is a possible attack building up here. So if the rook could move forward here, along with a rook here, there's some checkmate threats going on, possibly. But it looks like the king at the moment can try and escape out here. So there is this threat, if we go back here, of check. And then, if the king were to go here, it's kind of really trapping the king in. And if the king would go here, then bishop and rook could pile up on that knight and capture. Anyway, the game continues with the best move being played. The rook kind of moves in here to back up this pawn, and the game continues with a check. So it's getting serious now. If the rook could move here, once the king goes there, we have a possible mate threat, but the knight is covering that, so maybe the bishop is thinking about knocking that out, and trying to get the rooks up here to attack the king. So the game continues with the king being forced forward. And now we have the knight knocked out here with the threat of rook to a6. A checkmate threat here, because this pawn is covering this, and the rook is covering these squares. So Tall's king is slowly getting cornered here. So the game continues with this b4 move, the best move in the position, but Tall is pretty much losing here. It looks like white is ahead by +4, especially he's just down a piece now as well, for the moment, unless that rook tries to recapture. But what happens next? The bishop retreats now. So now, white is just ahead in material. And the game continues with a capture. And this is an inaccuracy leading to a mate in 6. King to b5 would have been better. So we could take a quick look at that. If king to b5, well then, let's see. Possibly this pawn could just be captured here. And, Botvinnik is just ahead no matter what. And that's a habit to get into. If you can't directly mate your opponent's king, well then you can try and win material. Win a pawn, and then 2 pawns. Or, like this, go ahead a piece. And then you can use your extra pieces to win the endgame. And you can do that by trading all the other pieces off. So you just have like this extra bishop. And then you want to avoid trading too many pawns, because if all the pieces and pawns were traded off and you just had 1 bishop, that's not enough to win. But if you keep the pawns on the board, you can use your extra piece and your king to knock out your opponent's pawns and promote your own. So the finale of the game here, after capture, bishop attacks, the king is forced forward, and then this traps the king. And so now the threat is to move this rook here with mate. And it looks like the only thing that can be done, or one of the only things, is rook to e2, and the king would just grab the rook. So that just delays the inevitable. The other rook would come over here with check. The king could move up to d3, and then the rook would check again. And after the king captures, well then, I don't know, it looks like the opponent's king would be a goner then. So anyway, this is where Tal resigned, because there's no way to stop this checkmate threat here. The bishop is doing a good job of covering this square. The pawn here, could try and run, but it would be too late because of this rook battery. All right, well, let me wrap it up there. Feel free to leave comments at any time. Let me know what you think of this game, or if there are specific chess players that you would like to see in future videos. I can go over some of their games. Also, please like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. So thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.